Hello everyone, I am joined today by Ash Paulson, who had the opportunity to play 10 hours of Sea of Stars. Now, many of you might be aware of the fact that a ton of reviews have gone up for this game. It is a massive indie game, an RPG that is a love letter to tons of classic RPGs from the Super Nintendo era, and that kind of falls straight down Ash's wheelhouse. He has been all about this game, super excited for it, and just ready to play it as soon as possible. And fortunately, he's gotten the chance to go 10 hours with the game, and really, it's his opinion that matters most. This is the only opinion you should care about, besides your own, of course. So Ash, tell me, how bad is it?
Oh, I'm smiling. I clearly have hated my time with the game so far, right? No, I as you said, Derek, I have been so excited for this game for years now. It's been years coming, and as you said, it's a love letter to games like Chrono Trigger, Illusion of Gaia, Final Fantasy VI. I mean, you could not possibly develop a game that is more tailored to my tastes. And, Chrono Trigger is my favorite game of all time. So I've been highly anticipating this, and we got a code late last week, so I spent the entire weekend playing it. And as you said, I'm about 10 hours in, and honestly, I'm having a great time. It's not perfect. There are a few quibbles here and there, but in general, I'm having a wonderful time, and this is a pretty special experience that Sabotage Studio have crafted here. At least so far.
I mean, it always looked gorgeous, to be sure. It's just something that stood out immediately. For everyone, really. It's just like one of those that make you see and go, oh. It definitely has that effect right off the bat. But the strangest thing to me has always been the fact that it's apparently a spin-off, connection to, prequel, I don't know, to The Messenger. And how connected are the two? Because they couldn't seem like more different games, having not actually played The Messenger.
It's from what I remember. It's been several years since I played The Messenger last, which also a great game. You should go check it out if you like Ninja Gaiden style platformers. But this is a distant prequel to that, as far as I understand it, like a distant prequel. And at least as far as I've gotten so far, there isn't anything that would, come even close to requiring knowledge of The Messenger's story. I'm sure there are ways that it, vaguely connects later on, but from what I can tell, this seems to be pretty much a standalone adventure, and maybe there's some trappings for those who are really up on the Messenger's lore. But in general, this is very much its own standalone story, and you shouldn't, consider the Messenger a prerequisite to playing this game necessarily.
Yeah, I figured that'd be the case. It makes sense with it being such a different genre altogether. But I was just curious off the bat, just because it always seemed weird to me that they decided to bill it as a prequel more than anything else.
That surprised me too, because you wouldn't be able to tell really. Even if you hadn't played The Messenger, I don't think you'd ever get the sense that this is kind of a part of a bigger or wider universe. It definitely feels like its own thing, very much standalone story. And as I said, I'm about 10 hours in, which, from what I can tell, is about a third of the game. This is very much inspired by Chrono Trigger in that sense as well, in that it's not a giant, super massive, long, 100-hour RPG, which I appreciate because I'm coming off of playing Tears of the Kingdom. So it's nice to have a smaller, bite-sized RPG to kind of, to sink my teeth into. And so from what I've been told by the developer, it's around 30 hours for a standard playthrough. Unless you're going for 100%, then it's probably a little bit longer, much like Chrono Trigger. But yeah, so I'm about 10 hours in, and I just finished what seems to me to be the first major story arc. So I feel like I'm probably about a third of the way in, and it's great. I'm having a great time. Everything you've seen of the game, Derek, if you played the demo, I don't know if you did, but everything you've seen of the game leading up to release, it delivers on that promise. The pixel art is gorgeous. The soundtrack is great, with guest composer Yasumi Mitsuda joining the main composer for the game, and the story is intriguing. The characters are, with a couple of exceptions, the characters are really interesting, and the battle system is a lot deeper and more nuanced than you might think at first. I'm just having a great time with it, and I'm thinking about it, and I just want to go right back in to keep playing it as soon as I can.
That's awesome. I'm so glad it came out so well. What is the overall story? Because that's something I'm not actually sure of. What is our inciting incident? What are we building towards here? Obviously, we don't want any spoilers or anything like that, but what is the sort of crux of the story that we're going for? What are we looking toward?
So basically, you play as there are these. The two main characters are solstice warriors, and one is born on the winter solstice, and one was born on the summer solstice, and so they represent the sun and the moon respectively, and basically it's kind of your typical RPG. You know, they have to go out into the world and save the land from the machinations of this guy known as the Fleshmancer. So he seems to be, or they seem to be, the villain behind the scenes right now. I don't know where things are going necessarily, but yeah, that's basically kind of it. It starts as a fairly typical RPG story. You've got these two plucky heroes who got to go out and save the world, right? But then things aren't quite what they seem. They're joined by their best friend, who's maybe my favorite character introduced this year, like my favorite new character from any game this year. His name's Varl, and he's just like the most lovable, positive, just happy-go-lucky guy, and I can't get enough of this character. And anybody who's played the demo kind of already knows what this guy's like. But yeah, and so I would say the setup to begin with is a little bit standard, for a JRPG. But I have a feeling things are going to get a little crazy and go places where I'm not quite expecting. So I wouldn't say the story is necessarily the best part of the game so far, but it's still very engaging, and I'm curious. It's also quite dark, surprisingly. Like there something happens in the first 2 hours of the game where I'm like, oh, okay, that's maybe even the first hour, and I'm like, oh man, that's actually really messed up. So yeah, it's definitely going places, and I would say the pacing so far is pretty good. There hasn't really been too much downtime. There's always something new happening, to a new goal that's kind of pushing you forward. And as I said, I just finished the first major story arc, and things have kind of shifted in terms of where things are going. And I'm like, oh, okay, so it's not quite what I expected. It kind of reminds me of Okami in that way a little bit, because as you might remember, that game kind of takes place across 3 overall story arcs too, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, of course, Okami's much longer, and that's something that some people complain about. This is a significantly shorter game, but it definitely feels like it's kind of playing out in overall arcs. And so the first one has been a little bit standard, but things seem to be really opening up in scope now that I'm, about a third of the way in, it seems.
Very cool, very cool. So let's talk about gameplay, because you said it was a combination of a lot of these classic RPGs. I guess we'll start with the battle system, since I'm assuming that's what you're going to be doing the most of. So what are battles like? What's its unique hook?
So as you've seen from, and you can see in the footage here that we're showing right now, the battle system is very much based on Chrono Trigger. So there's no transition to a separate battle screen, right? All the enemies that you can see and fight, they're on the field maps that you're playing on, and then when you run into an enemy, or when one catches you, you just go right into battle right where you are. And so it's very much like Chrono Trigger in that sense. There are dual techs, so 2 of your characters can do combo attacks and for stronger attacks or stronger healing, things like that. But what's interesting about it is there's no active time meter. There's no speed stat. Basically, you can see counters above each enemy that tell you when they're going to attack. But when they're charging up for stronger attacks, these things called locks come up. And every different kind of attack you can do has its own property. There's slashing attacks, blunt impact attacks, sun attacks, moon attacks, poison attacks, things like that. And so when these locks appear, and that is indicative of an enemy charging up a stronger attack, if you can hit all the locks before that attack pops off, you can effectively cancel that enemy's attack. So let's say you need to hit, a lock comes up and it's like a sun, a sword, and an impact icon. If you can pull off all 3 of those attacks before the counter runs out, you can cancel them from doing that attack entirely. And even if you don't destroy the lock completely, you can weaken that attack by 40% if you hit most of the locks, but not all of them. So there's a great deal of strategy in play that you may not be expecting if you're coming off of something like Chrono Trigger. Because, again, my favorite game of all time, but it's not a particularly hard game. And there's not a ton of depth to the battle system necessarily. Whereas here, it's a little bit subversive. And this is also a really high damage game. What's really interesting is that the game basically encourages you to use your magic and your special moves because you kind of have to. And every physical attack you do recharges 3 of your magic points, right? So the game tells you straight up, don't hoard your magic points, don't save them for a boss. Keep using your magic because you're going to need it to get through these fights, and you're always regenerating MP anyway. So, and enemies do a lot of damage to you, so you're going to be healing a lot, and you really have to think your way through a lot of encounters. Some of them are a little bit easier than others, but in general, you kind of have to think on your feet and be ready to be healing and kind of watching your health at all times, because even at the beginning of the game, an enemy can do maybe a third of your health in one hit. Yeah, take away a third of your health, and sometimes even closer to half if you are unable to stop one of those stronger attacks from being popped off at a weaker power level. So, and then there's other things that go on, like you can there's something called free mana live mana that pops out of enemies when you do physical attacks, and any of your characters can use that live mana to charge up their own physical attacks to be stronger or add new properties to their physical attacks. So there's a lot more going on in this battle system than you might at first think, and it can be pretty challenging. But what's cool about it is that there is a lot of accessibility too. So you can equip certain relics that basically, there's a story mode relic, which basically increases your HP by 100% and reduces damage that enemies do to you. So you can make it easier on yourself in various ways if you want. So you're not forced to play through at a higher difficulty if you're just there for the story, right? So I always appreciate that when games are more accessible for all audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. How do new abilities work? Is this a game that's very much focused on going to towns, getting new equipment? Do you get new spells and abilities through towns, or is it something you learn as you level up? What kind of systems are we looking at there?
It's refreshingly straightforward. From what I can tell, there's no crafting really. It really is you go to a new town, you get better equipment. You can find better equipment in the field, so you don't have to necessarily buy it like in treasure chests and stuff. But there's a physical attack, magical attack, physical defense, and magic defense stats, and better equipment raises those stats, and that's basically it. It's refreshingly simple and old school. What's really interesting though is there's also there's experience, but the party shares experience. So there's each individual characters don't have experience and level up by themselves. The entire party levels up together when you hit a certain experience level, and then much like in Super Mario RPG, you can select a certain stat to boost even further. Obviously when you level up, all of your stats are boosted, but you can select one stat to boost even more to kind of customize your character's stats a little bit in that way. And also, speaking of Mario RPG, one of the things I forgot to mention, there are timed hits. So there are timed attacks and timed defense for basically everything. All of your physical attacks, all of your special attacks, most of them. So you can boost damage by hitting, the attack button at the right time during the animation, or reduce damage by doing a timed defense. And there are also, it kind of reminds me of Mario and Luigi as well. Some of the bros attacks, how you have to hit certain triggers and stuff to maximize damage. It's really cool. There's a lot going on here. But to go back to what you were saying, yeah, you just get new equipment. It raises your stats, and there are accessories that can provide different cool effects and buffs, and it's super old school in that way. And like I said, I find some people might find that too simplistic. Personally, I find it refreshing. There's so many systems layered upon layer in modern RPGs, and that's fine, like crafting and all this other stuff, but this game just is no, it's just here are your stats, they go up when you get better equipment, and that's it. It's great. And you level up and get new abilities, and that's how how you get so so at least so far I've gotten new abilities as part of major story events. So I haven't necessarily got them from leveling up, but a certain thing will happen in a scene, and a power will awaken, and one of the characters will learn a new ability, essentially, and they all learn them at different times. Okay. So, Yeah, and actually, one thing to go back to the characters, I forgot to mention this earlier, but I mentioned that you play as, the two protagonists are these Solstice Warriors, Valir and Zale, and what's both good and bad about this is you can choose either one to be your party leader at the beginning of the game, and then you can switch to the party leader whenever you want, and it doesn't affect the story. So personally, I have Valir as my leader because she was born on the winter solstice, and I like cold, and she's cool, and I think she's just kind of a badass. And so you can have whatever main character you want, and I think that's really cool. On the other hand, though, they kind of proved to be the least, or they so far have proven to be the least interesting characters in the game because they're just a little bit vanilla, if that makes sense. Like, all the characters surrounding them so far are quite a bit more interesting than they are. And one thing I noticed is that, sometimes, in a game like this, they'll react to certain things in the field, right? Like, if you try to go somewhere before you're supposed to, your party leader will say, oh, we have to go talk to that person before we do this. But I noticed that no matter who you have as your leader, they say the same thing. And so they don't have as much, as much of a, I guess, unique personality. Like, they don't say anything different. Whoever your leader is, they'll say the same thing, and I found that to be a little bit like, I'd like them to kind of show their unique characteristics a little more, right?
Yeah, it's always appreciated. It's just a little bit of a step up from the silent protagonist, it sounds, but it's like not like you get that much of a unique personality out of them, which is a bit of a shame.
Right.
How many party members can you have in your party, and how many party members do you have right now? I guess is the best way to put that.
So, like Chrono Trigger, you can have three characters in your party at a time, and right now I have 4. It looks like there's a space for a 5th one, so I have a feeling there are probably 5 playable characters total. And then there's a cargo slot as well that, when you have NPCs traveling with you, they're there, but they don't actually fight, of course. So, yeah, so far I've got 3, and it took quite a while before I got my 4th party member. Obviously, it happened sometime in the first 10 or so hours, but you're basically rolling with the first 2, and then, as I said, Garl, an amazing character. One of the reasons that Zale and Valir maybe don't stand out as much because Garl's just so amazing. And so you have those 3 for quite a while, and then you get a 4th a little later on, but it seems like there's space for a 5th.
Okay.
Yeah.
How beyond battles, obviously you're going to be exploring a bunch. Is there any puzzles, or is it just sort of a simple, like, moving from point A to point B, fighting monsters along the way?
So what's interesting is there actually is more of a puzzle element in this game than I thought. And so when I did a preview of the game last year, and I was told by the developer that their main inspirations were Chrono Trigger, Illusion of Gaia, and FF6, which is awesome. But what I wasn't expecting is that there's actually quite a bit of Lufia 2 in this game as well. Not only from some of the music samples I've heard, like the synths they're using, but also in the way that there are field actions. Like there's a grappling hook that you get a little ways in. There's a little wind puff that you can do to move blocks around, and basically you use those to solve environmental and traversal puzzles. So it isn't just going from point A to point B. There are puzzles in the field to solve that require use of these field abilities, and it seems like there's at least 1 or 2 more that I haven't gotten to yet. But I was really pleased to see that there's actually kind of a Lufia 2 influence here with puzzles in the field. You kind of have to figure out how to get to certain chests or get to a certain exit in a room that you need to progress through a dungeon. And these dungeons are in depth. They're surprisingly long. And I say dungeons, but that can be anything from like a haunted mansion to, like a mountain path. But they're treated as dungeons because they're really in depth and quite long and pretty meaty. So it's not just a simple matter of like, oh, okay, I got to go through this minor area to get to where I'm going. Like, no, every area is treated as like its own kind of mini dungeon, and it's pretty cool.
I guess related to that, since you say you earn these field actions and whatnot, does that mean you can go to earlier places and unlock areas that you couldn't go to before? Is that how that works, or is it just...
It seems like
okay.
It. So that there have been a lot of things that I've passed so far that I can't really do anything with at the moment because I don't have the right key item or the right whatever. So I've already been taking screenshots of places I need to remember to go back to because, yeah, it seems like there's a lot of optional and side content that requires you to kind of backtrack with new items or new abilities and things to see what's going on. Okay. So I'm looking forward to that. There's definitely some side stuff going on.
Nice. I guess is there any other gameplay elements that, we covered battles, we covered exploration. Is there anything else worth mentioning about gameplay, or does that pretty much cover the basics, I guess?
I think that covers the basics. Like, I guess the thing I would double down on is just like the battle. Like, don't necessarily take what you see of the battle system at face value. There's a lot more going on under the hood and a lot more strategy than you might be thinking at first glance. There's definitely some interesting strategy and a surprisingly high degree of challenge when it comes to kind of figuring out how to, in what order to attack enemies to make sure they don't unleash their most powerful attacks on you, especially in succession. So, just be prepared for a challenge, but of course that challenge can be mitigated with optional relics if you don't want that challenge level.
Good to hear. Good to hear. So, I guess before we wrap up here, is there anything about, obviously you've been very positive about the game so far, is there anything that sort of holds it back for you that maybe is not as good as you were hoping?
I would say that there is a lack of polish in the writing, and that's not to say that like the story or the storytelling is
bad.
It's not like, or juvenile. That's the word I was looking for. It's not to say that the storytelling is juvenile or anything, but there's just a lot of polish issues, a lot of typos, a lot of missing commas, things that won't necessarily bother most people necessarily, but it bothers me because that kind of stuff matters to me. But I think because the writing polish was so high in the Messenger, I was expecting a bit more on that front, but the writing just feels a little bit dry and kind of wooden compared to, not all the time, but compared to the Messenger, and just not quite as polished. So I would like to see that kind of stuff addressed in a patch. Maybe there is one. I haven't been told that, but maybe there is like a day one patch coming that'll address some of that. But there's just a lack of polish in the writing that surprised me, considering how polished the Messenger is on that front. And so that's, I guess, the main thing. But again, the story is still interesting and the characters are still cool. But as I did mention, the two main characters are a little bit vanilla, and they're just flanked by all these characters who are quite a bit more interesting than they are, so far, at least. And then I would say the load times, at least on Switch, this is all based on me playing on Switch, they can be a little long in the tooth. Not a big deal, but there's kind of a long initial loading before you get into the game, and then just transitions between major areas can take a little bit longer than maybe you'd like, but, you know,
but in the
grand scheme of things,
transition in the battles, I'm assuming, are still pretty snappy.
Super snappy,
okay.
And transitions between screens in the same like area, just like Chrono Trigger, super fast, okay. Super, like, there's no loading whatsoever. It's when you go from like an area to the world map, and from the world map to somewhere else, that the loading can be a little bit long in the tooth.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of anything else to really ask, but I mean, right now it just seems like an extremely solid game. Like, I guess just to wrap things up, obviously this is getting a ton of praise from every which way, and right now it just seems like it does classic things very well. Is that how you describe this? Just a game that handles everything very well in a slightly unique way?
Yeah, I would say that it builds on, you know, all the things that we love about the Golden Age of JRPGs, and it builds on those with its own unique ideas. Like I said, the battle system is just, there's a lot more going on under the hood than there is in a game like Chrono Trigger, which, you know, is great to see. It's not just aping what came before, what made these games so great. It's building on them and introducing their own unique ideas. Kind of like how Shovel Knight took the Mega Man and DuckTales formula, and even a little bit of Zelda 2, and it's faithful to those games, but it also improves upon them in certain ways with modern trappings and such. So it's everything you love about games like Chrono Trigger and such, but with modern trappings and quality of life features. Gorgeous pixel art that could not have been done back in the 90s. Amazing animation. This game is such a looker. Oh my god. And then if you love the soundtracks of those games like I do, you can literally hear some of the same samples and synths used in Chrono Trigger, Lufia 2, used in the composition of this soundtrack. And most of the soundtrack was composed by the same guy who did The Messenger. His name is Rainbow Dragon Eyes, aka Eric Brown. But then you got Yasunori Mitsuda, the composer of Chrono Trigger, contributing 10 guest tracks. So to say the soundtrack is a treat is not doing it justice. It is exactly what you want out of this kind of game. If you're just itching for like a new 90s chiptune Chrono Trigger style soundtrack, you're getting it with this game, and it is just a treat for the ears.
That's all sounds pretty great. I gotta say, it sounds like we have a real hit on our hands with this one. Hopefully, it gets all the success. And yeah, I'm curious to see if your opinions change over time. I kind of doubt it. I think your opinions are pretty set in stone at this point. But yeah, I think that covers it for your thoughts on the first 10 hours of Sea of Stars, and honestly beyond. Let's be honest. Just by the sounds of it, it has to really mess things up if it's gonna fall from this point. So yeah,
I agree. I think the main thing is I'm not necessarily sure that the main characters are going to get more interesting. Hopefully they do, but I can see that maybe being my takeaway complaint from this is that, okay, maybe the characters could have been a little bit more interesting, but again, they're flanked by really cool characters. So as I said, Garl, the best. It will come Game of the Year time. If we do a best new character of 2023 category, he might be it. So we'll see.
There you go. Well, yeah. Thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/gvgaming, but even just subscribing to the channel and ringing that bell helps us a ton. So, until next time, bye!